Hello, Endgame viewers. Thanks for joining us early for the 2025 season. It's not even 2025, but we have to dig into the ADP. There's no need to wait. And we have a very special guest today. It is Chris Towers from CBS Sports, writer, podcaster, contributor, also the newsletter for CBS Sports. Don't forget to subscribe to that. And dare I say, a rival YouTuber. But here we go, joining forces. But look, if you Google, fantasy baseball, or you go on YouTube, you search fantasy baseball, that's what comes up. It's fantasy baseball today. So this is your source for everything.
That's all Frank. Like he's the mastermind behind all that. I just show up. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you showed up here. Thank you for showing up. How are you doing so far this holiday season?
I'm good. We were talking before the show. We're both native South Floridians, and I'm in New York now, so it's weird to be wearing a sweater and I have to wear socks on Christmas because it's freezing, and it's weird because South Florida, you're so used to. I lived there for 30 years. You're so used to it's 75 degrees and maybe raining, but it's never cold on Christmas. So it's a weird transition for me to make, even though it's been 5 years. I'm still not quite used to actually being cold around Christmas.
No, I don't think you ever get used to it. I've been here. I'm in Texas now, and I can't say it's cold. It's definitely not anywhere close to snowing. But even though I've been here a lot longer, I still feel like cold is just weird. My body will never get used to it. I just feel like it should be 70 degrees every day, and I don't like it when it isn't.
It was weird because at least in New York this year, it was really mild up until December. November was really nice. It was in the 50s and 60s a lot, even through November. And it was oh, it's going to be a mild winter. And then single digit days. And it's oh, I forgot the monkey paw curled. And it can be pretty brutal, but it's fine. It's fine. You can bundle up. That's the thing I say. In those South Florida summers when it's 87 degrees and 1,000% humidity at night, there's nothing you can do. You're just stuck. It's just gross all the time for 8 straight months. At least here, I can throw on enough layers that I'm okay. You can only take so many layers off before, you run the risk of getting arrested. So yeah. that's the I'll take this over the constant humidity and mugginess personally.
It's like a sauna with no off switch. Just does not come on ever. Yeah. But I'll take that over 2 months of cold, honestly. I just got the tropical blood. Here's one good thing about becoming a New Yorker instead of a Floridian. You have a winning baseball team, unlike Miami. You have a team
Unfortunately, I see the Marlins hat behind you. I am still a Marlins fan. My wife did adopt the Mets, so she's got that going for her. I appreciate that and enjoy that for her. And I feel we'll see how the next 15 or so years go, but I have always felt a little bit of a kinship with Mets fans because they seem pretty miserable about the whole experience. And that's I can't jibe with Yankees fans because they expect good things to happen. And that's never been my experience as a baseball fan. So I've always appreciated the fatalism of the Mets fan base. So we'll see how the Juan Soto era goes now that they're riding a little higher. Well, we'll see.
Yeah. I do have a Marlins related question for you, but let's stay up at the very, very end.
Sure.
Because probably nobody else really cares. And this is a perfect segue also to a question I do have. I was going to save this, but let's talk Juan Soto because the last video I just put out, and again, I don't like to put out takes, and just things that, are absurd just to get views or whatever. But digging into it, and I just come out my baseball forecaster. I've been reading it. Juan Soto going to the Mets. Everyone's excited, not just Mets fans, but I legitimately want to know, do you think he is worth a first round top 10 pick? Is he a no doubt top 10er? Because I looked at it and you're looking at the return on investment based on the last 5 years. He's been a first round pick every year, right? Mm-hmm. We know Juan Soto, you know what you're getting. He has not delivered top 12 return except for last year. And that was the 1 year he was with the Yankees. And that's because the home runs jumped up. And so people don't think, well, you're going to New York, what's the difference? but there's a difference in park factor. There's a difference in lineup. You don't have Aaron Judge there protecting you. So I don't think it's crazy, me personally, to say that I don't have to take him in the first round. Is that going too far?
I think part of it for me is I think there are legitimately like 15, first round caliber hitters, especially this year. And obviously there are a couple of pitchers going in that range. So in your 15 team leagues, I think everybody gets one. In your 12 team leagues, I actually think this is a good year to pick later in your drafts, because I do think there's a drop off. Maybe it's more once you factor in, Skeens and Scooble and maybe Wheeler, you could say there are like 18-ish guys who I would consider on that level. And then there's probably a drop off. It maybe depends on how you view like Ronald Acuna when he comes back. But so like if you have Juan Soto 6th, I think that's reasonable. If you have Juan Soto 12th, I think that's reasonable. I don't think there's a ton separating Juan Soto and Elly De La Cruz and Mookie Betts and Corbin Carroll, like Francisco Lindor, even, who's going to go probably later than all those guys. I don't think there's a ton separating them. Obviously, they're very different types of players, but the one thing I will say, and I think it's true of both Juan Soto and Yordan Alvarez, especially, because I think those are the two in that first round group who are basically zeros in stolen bases. I think Yordan actually stole 6 last year, which was twice what he had ever stolen in a season, maybe more, but still 6 is not very much. So the one thing I will say about those two guys is, we have all our valuation formulas and everything, and those are always going to tell us that stolen bases are incredibly valuable if you can get them from a first round caliber hitter. And I agree with that. But then when you're actually drafting this year in this player pool, and I think it's been true the last couple of years, but I think it's really cemented this year, I kind of think the elite 4 category guys who don't really steal bases might be a little undervalued this year, if only because every draft I've done so far, you get to basically every point in the draft, it's easier to find stolen bases than it is to find other offensive production. And so, you're going to take a hit when you take a stolen base guy in the 10th round, relatively speaking. But I find that when I get to the 8th, 10th, 12th, 15th round, there's always guys that I could find stolen bases from. And so if you take Elly De La Cruz, and we're going to talk about him, but when you take, I think Elly is just kind of such an outlier in this regard that it's worth getting to now. He's really like a 2.5 category player at this point. He's going to be a standout in stolen bases. There's no question. I think you say he's the favorite to lead the league in steals. He's going to give you a lot of runs and a pretty good home run total, but not a huge one, right? Like I think there's upside, but what was it, 23 last year, something like that. So you're putting yourself at a big disadvantage in batting average by taking him in the first round. You're probably putting yourself at a disadvantage in RBI that you're going to have to make up for. And it locks you into it. I guess it's more accurate to say it locks you out of a lot of values later in the draft, because there are going to be a lot of times when guys fall, and like Tommy Edman is going super late. He's like 180th in ADP right now or something. And you might reach a point where it's just like, he's the clear best player available. It's also, there's no point in getting the 30 steals from Tommy Edman if you already have Elly De La Cruz and another stolen base guy. So that's where I do think there is some hidden value in a Juan Soto or Yordan Alvarez type, because it just, I think the strong base in the other 4 categories that they give you frees you up to not have to worry so much about batting average, which I feel like batting average and whip are like the two that it can be easy to forget about, but they're probably the hardest ones to find in the current environment. Certainly batting average for hitters. If you can get a standout batting average guy in the first round, which Juan Soto, it always feels like he should be better in batting average. He hasn't hit 300 since 2021, which is kind of shocking, but 288 last year. I think 290-ish is a reasonable expectation. It can make getting through the rest of your draft a lot easier. So whether you have Juan Soto as a first rounder or not, I think that's the range. I think there's that clear top three. I think there's a couple of guys after that who are in a mini tier of their own, and then it really opens up. And I think Juan Soto is absolutely in that kind of mini third tier.
Yeah, and there's we're going to reference you have this argument for guys like Jordan Alvarez and to some extent against Elly De La Cruz. I'm looking at the article we did about a week ago, top targets, biggest fades in early ADP data. And so a lot of the reasoning is laid out there. There's two ways of thinking about it. A lot of times, in baseball, this is the thing I find the biggest, and you're also someone, I guess a two-sport fantasy analyst, athlete, football and baseball. That's the difference with football is it's all about upside, right? Upside. I'll take the risk because that one guy having a monster season makes all the difference. In baseball, it's almost the opposite. The early, first couple rounds, like just mitigate risk, right? Don't get a bust.
And I think especially when we're talking about, the ADP data that we're talking about is basically just NFBC. So it's mostly 15-team leagues. A lot of the ones that are drafting right now, most of the ones that are drafting right now are just draft and holds. So people are really afraid of risk in these drafts. NFBC has no IL spot, so that also plays a big point. Like that's one thing that we're talking about ADP data right now, and we may get to February and March when CBS and ESPN and Yahoo start to have their drafts and we get, data from different sites. It might look completely different, right? Every site's going to have their different quirks and their different. And so, that's one thing that, I think a lot of people, this is why in NFBC drafts, you'll see, Emmanuel Clase as sometimes a second round pick in a 15-team league, because it's just, he has led the American League in saves 3 straight years. He almost led the majors in saves 3 straight years. There is no safer bet for saves than Emmanuel Clase. And in this specific draft, people are trying to avoid zeros. So I think that's a relevant point for this discussion. Yeah.
Right. And that's exactly right. NFBC is basically where you're getting your data. I'm in a slow draft right now. I like the slow drafts. NFBC 50. And just to let people know, in those, especially your reference ADP, a lot of those are 2 catcher leagues. So catches will be bumped up, and then closers, because, draft and hold, you're not gonna be able to play the waiver wire for saves. So before I ask the next question, I think it's pertinent to ask, what can we take away from early ADP when it's technically right now, as we talk, not even 2025 yet? Because a lot of things are going to change. Obviously, free agency is just in the beginning stages, a lot of dominoes still to fall. But what do you, who's going to be digging in AP basically for the next 3 months, what do you take away from it right now?
Well, I think one thing that we can say is that while NFBC has its format specific quirks relative to the way most people play fantasy baseball, because most people play 12-team leagues, probably not 2 catcher leagues, either head-to-head points, head-to-head categories. Like the 15-team Roto League is what so much of the discussion in the fantasy baseball industry is about. And I don't know, maybe 5% of the people who actually play fantasy baseball play in that format, the 2 catcher 15-team. Like it's because NFBC is the only data source really right now for ADP, because it's one of the only places people are drafting, and because it's where all the, the high stakes players and the high profile players are going to be playing there. So it tends to have this outsized impact on the way we discuss fantasy baseball. And it's important to keep in mind the things that happen in these leagues that don't happen in a lot of other leagues. And you'll hear a lot of discussion about, you can't take a player with injury risk, because in a 15-team no IL league, absolutely. If Jordan Alvarez misses 40 games, your season might be tanked if you take him in the first round. That's not necessarily true in a 12-team head-to-head points league where you're only starting 9 hitters. That is where the format differences really come in. And you mentioned fantasy football, where you're all about upside because you've only got, 7 roster spots to fill in a typical lineup, plus your kicker and defense. Like, you need maximum impact from every roster spot. That's less true when you're starting 23 players in a 15-team roto league, So that is where the format kind of changes, and people tend to be a little more skeptical about risks, although there are specific instances in this year's drafts where that is not at all true. And I think it's interesting to note where and when, like Jazz Chisholm is now top 25 player because the upside that we saw with the Yankees, I think it was a 35 homer, 58 stolen base pace. That is upside worth chasing, because if he hits anything close to that, if he gets to 90% of that, he's going to be a first round pick next year, or at least a first round caliber player. And so we're okay taking the risk there. We're okay taking the risk with Paul Skeens, who we've never seen throw, more. I think he threw 164 innings last year. We're making that leap with him as almost a top 10 pick in the draft so far. So it's interesting where and when the player pool does and doesn't get dinged for upside. But it's to say that you have to keep in mind the early ADP data is very heavily tilted towards one format that doesn't necessarily apply to the way a lot of people play fantasy baseball. So grains of salt, I think, all around when we're talking about this stuff.
Right. I think it's a good way to get just get a gauge on the people who are the hardcore drafters, right? You're drafting in December, you're pretty into it already, and analysts and people feel about a player. So I think it's anything that stands out, like, oh, I didn't know this guy was going to be valued that highly. I think it's worth noting. But it's funny you talk about it, how ironic it is to talk about risk. That's why a lot of people, Shohei Ohtani was not the first pick in any fantasy draft last year, because number one, locks you into the utility spot, and number two, guys had a lot of injuries. It's like, we don't know. And I'll just say it again. I took the L on Aaron Judge last year. That was my line of thinking was, are we going to have a 60 home run season? Or are we going to have a season where he misses, half the games because of injury? What have we seen more of? There was risk there. There was risk that he was going to get injured and he doesn't get you steals. And, is he really going to go off? Okay, well, he did.
That's the thing about, because we've got this true top tier now, I think, of Judge, Witt, and Ohtani in some order. It's going to be those three at the top of almost every draft. There might be a few. Has anybody else? Okay, so Gunnar Henderson's gone as early as 2. Jose Ramirez went 1 at one point, but for the most part, you're going to see those 3, I think, as the clear top 3, and then Elly, Jose Ramirez, Gunnar Henderson will mix in. Judge is the only one who's played at his 2025 or 2024 level more than once. Ohtani is obviously incredible, but last year was on a completely different level, not just from what he had done previously, but what from any player basically in fantasy history had done. And obviously Bobby Witt, very good player, had never been a $50 player before last year. So Judge is both, in terms of track record, I think the safest, because we have now 2022 and 2024 where he has played at that $50, kind of level in terms of auction value. And then also maybe the riskier one, because he's 32 or 33. What is Aaron? He'll be 33 a month after opening day. And that history of injury, it's like he's established a baseline that is impossibly high. And there's also obviously a ton of risk there. So it's really interesting how you handle that top 3. And I don't know what order you put them in. I have Witt first and then Judge and Ohtani, but I have no strong opinions about any of it. I just, with Ohtani, I worry he's not going to run as much when he's pitching. I feel very confident he's not going to get 59 stolen bases again. Where it settles, I'm not sure, but I also just think the pitching side brings a lot of injury risk. And, we've seen him put together incredible performances while playing injured, which makes it even more remarkable what he did in 2024. But just because he's been able to play through the injuries that he's suffered while pitching, and still be a hitter and still be a remarkably productive hitter doesn't mean it will always be true, right? Like if he can play through a ligament issue in his elbow, that's one thing. What if he injures his shoulder? How does that impact him? You know, we saw it was his non-throwing shoulder last year during the World Series, but you know, how does that, I just think that's enough risk with what I think is lower stolen base potential to drop him third, but it's razor thin margins between the three of them.
Oh yeah. No, well, I'll tell you, my NFBC 50 I'm doing right now. It's a slow draft. I got the number 1 pick. I took Ohtani. I have Ohtani right now. So that was actually the first offseason video I did for this year is who's number 1, because I think it is a legitimate debate, even though you think, how can it not be Ohtani? People, you have to realize, I mean, not even having to think about pitching, much less be out there, you know, once a week, that probably helped him hone in on the hitting. And, you know, Ohtani is an alien. We know that, but still, we can't ignore the potential risk here. So I took Ohtani 1, but, you know, if I have the number 1 pick my next draft, I'll probably take Witt the next time. You know what I mean? And I think, honestly, he might be the safest, if there is such a thing, out of those 3. But right now, I'm going probably Ohtani with Judge, but you know, I don't think there's a wrong answer there. But that leads to potentially the number 4, at least according to the early ADP. He is number 4. So quickly back to Elly. So where would you feel comfortable drafting him? And is he someone that you're just kind of maybe taking a step back and saying, no, I'll let somebody else have him?
I have him 8th right now. And that probably means I'm not going to draft him because I put Kyle Tucker ahead of him. I put Gunnar Henderson ahead of him. I think Jose Ramirez is a fairly easy call ahead of him. So if any of those guys are on the board along with Elly, I'm just going to take them. And so, you know, Juan Soto versus Elly, I think is a very interesting debate. And that's why I brought it up when we talked about Juan Soto earlier, just because they could not be on more opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of what they bring to the table. And so it kind of depends on how you feel your draft is going to go and what you'd rather be targeting throughout the draft. But I think where I come down on Elly is specifically, I can't say he's a bad pick at the number 4 overall pick. Like, you know, he was where did he end up finishing last season? It was the number 7 hitter, according to the Fangraphs auction calculator. So look, if you get the number 7 player from the number 4 pick, you've avoided a loss, right? Like that's fine. But my problem with it is what I said earlier, how it really locks you in to a very specific approach throughout the rest of your draft. And what I mean by that is not just that there are going to be times when the best player available is a stolen base specialist and you can't really justify taking, like, does it really make sense to take Bryce Terang if he falls, if you've already got Elly, just because like that is so overkill. Like every marginal steal you get has less value once you reach a certain point. Right. And so then you have to take into account not just that part, but the fact that the later you go in the draft, the harder it is to find anyone who can help you in batting average. And Elly among the first round picks is by far the biggest drag on your batting average. I mean, like, you know, he might hit, if he hits 260, that's probably, is that a best case scenario for Elly De La Cruz? Probably not, but it's not far off. You know, he I guess 259 last year. Okay. But it's to say that like his best case scenario and Juan Soto's worst case scenario, there's probably a lot of overlap between those two. And so you're going to reach a point throughout your draft where, the best player available is someone who might hit 30 home runs and I need 30 home runs, but they're projected for a 230 batting. Like you can't take Kyle Schwarber if you have Elly De La Cruz, right? I mean, you can, but it just creates a lot more. I think it narrows your path throughout the draft to where you really have to focus. Like you might hit a point where if you take Elly De La Cruz, you almost have to take Luis Arias, who I don't really want on my teams because he's just batting average, but you might need that. And then that compounds the issue because, well, now you've got a first round pick who might hit 25 home runs That's fine, but it leaves you behind the other first round picks. Now you got to find power. Can you find power without sacrificing batting? I think it cuts off a lot of avenues throughout the draft in a way that I don't love not having the flexibility throughout the rest of my draft. So that's, I think, the biggest knock against Elly, where he might be worth that pick in a vacuum. He'll be 23 in about 2 weeks. So like we should be careful not to talk about him as if he's a finished product. If he cuts 3 points off his strikeout rate again in 2025, he might hit 35 homers with a 275 average and be the best player in fantasy. That's absolutely within the realm of possibility. He also still hasn't really shown he can hit lefties. He has faded a little bit in the second half of both of his seasons. The stolen bases, especially in the second half, I didn't know what to make of that, but it was more like a 40 steal pace after the All-Star break. Not sure, but like, what if he slows down a little bit? What if he's more of a 45 stolen base guy than a 60 plus stolen base guy? That also gets a little harder to justify. So I think he's a really good player. I think the margin for error when you're picking Elly De La Cruz at that point in the draft is just too slim to really justify it for me.
Yeah, makes total sense. And to your point about the average, he did hit 259, but the expected batting average was 240. Yeah.
That's what I was, when I said like I think I was thinking of his expected batting average being much lower. And look, he's a good candidate to beat that, right? Like he's so fast. He plays in a great park. Yeah.
But still, you got to also acknowledge, I mean, a guy who relies on his speed, his athleticism, his style of play. At some point, do we say, there's injury risk here? Because again, going back to, let's say, Ronald Acuna, is Elly De La Cruz going to take that step forward in plate discipline like Acuna did, where all of a sudden he cut his strikeout rate way down? He became a contact hitter with massive power and speed. Maybe, but when a guy strikes out 31% of the time, that's also a big leap to take this soon. So yeah, the risk might outweigh the potential reward.
Yeah, I probably won't be drafting him, and there will certainly be points in the season where that feels dumb. But I don't know if it's the best way to build a team in 2025.
The journey with Elly last year, if you had him, you would see it, and especially like on social media, for 2 weeks, there was a stretch. Everyone was like, this is the best player in the majors, this is MVP, this guy's going to go off. And then for 2 weeks, he would slump so badly, you didn't hear anything about him. Mm-hmm. You're like, wait a minute, what happened now? And he went 4 straight hitless games, and then all of a sudden he's back to being the best player in the majors. It's like, just strap on and hold on for the ride.
It requires a certain constitution, I think, to have a player like that on your team. It's like whenever we talk about Blake Snell on Fantasy Baseball today, it's always like, if you want to take, I'm out on Blake Snell at his price because he's like a top 12 SP this year, and I just can't justify that given everything about Blake Snell. But the thing you have to know, and this has happened, I think, 3 or 4 straight years now, you're going for a ride. And if you do not have the stomach for Blake Snell, those points when Blake Snell has a 6 ERA and is killing you every time out, you can't drop him. Like we know this. We know Blake Snell is going to have some stretches where he's just completely lost. His margin for error as a pitcher is really slim because he throws nothing in the strike zone. Right. And so he throws like 32% of his pitches in the strike zone or something outrageous. And so if you know that you are going to reach a point where you're fed up and you're going to drop Blake Snell, don't bother drafting him at any price, because it's the worst thing you can do is drop him when things are going poorly. Elly's never going to reach that point. There's never going to be a point where you're dropping Elly De La Cruz. But if you do not have the stomach for the ups and downs of that kind of player, just take them off your board, because it's going to cause you more stress. You might make a bad decision dropping a Blake Snell, which lots of people did over the past couple of years when things got bad, or trading Elly De La Cruz because you're just frustrated and you move him for a 2nd round pick and you end up losing out on a ton of value. Know yourself as a player before you go into your draft.
There you go. I think better and best ball is a good way to put it. Draft and hold.
Yeah,
absolutely. It gives you a ton of value. You don't have to sweat it, but yeah, you know what you're getting. A ton of upside for sure, but there's going to be ups and downs. But talk about pitcher. Let's talk about pitching then. Starting pitchers. Again, when we think about risk and return on value, as far as first round, second round, even, the conventional wisdom lately is you just don't take a pitcher in the first round because there's way too much risk. Even those who took the plunge last year in Spencer Strider didn't pay off. So how soon do you feel comfortable taking a starting pitcher? Who do you think should be the first starting pitcher? Because some people think it should be Paul Skeens. And who do you feel is going to be taken way too high? And obviously Blake Snell, you already mentioned him. Is there anybody else you feel like is just going to be a guy you're just out?
I have Paul Skeens all the way down at third at SP. And I know based on ADP, he's going, is he top 10 in the month? He's 10.6 in ADP. He's
First rounder.
Zach Wheeler, 10 picks later. I have Zach Wheeler ahead. I think I am open to the idea that there's no such thing as a safe pitcher. I think that is a perfectly reasonable approach that just everybody has injury risks, so don't worry about it. I think that's a reasonable approach. But when you're talking about, you're not just comparing Paul Skeens with a 10.6 ADP to Zach Wheeler and even Tarek Skubal, who's going a few picks after Paul Skeens, or Logan Gilbert or whoever. You're comparing him to Francisco Lindor and Juan Soto and all those guys who you are potentially passing on in order to take a pitcher who might just be the best pitcher in baseball already. Certainly looked like it last year. But what we haven't seen is what Paul Skeens looks like when they say, hey, it's March. You're going to go through spring training like a normal pitcher. And then we're expecting you to make 32 starts and go 6 innings every time out. Like, it's not to say he can't do it. It's just enough of an unknown. And I'm not quite convinced he's so far better than Tarek Skubal that I'm willing to take him ahead of Tarek Skubal. And then with Zach Wheeler, we know the upside's a little lower for him, although he does go on stretches like he did in the second half last year where he's as good on a per start basis as anybody in baseball. But Zach Wheeler has become kind of the preeminent workhorse among starting pitchers. And I'll value that a little more, especially in, a league where you do have to play the wire, where, especially a lot of what we talk about at CBS is the head-to-head points leagues where that volume really matters. Because the way our scoring format works, it's, I think, a full point per out that you generate and then an extra point for a strikeout. So like a 7-inning start with 5 strikeouts can be as valuable as a 5-inning start with 9 strikeouts in a way that is not necessarily true in a roto league. So that's part of the thought process there for me. But I'm probably going to be out on Paul Skeens. And unfortunately, I'm probably going to be out on Garrett Crochet, who I was at First Pitch Arizona back in early November. And I think he was like 13 or 15 in the ADP at that point. And I remember there was one panel where someone mentioned that. And there was like an outcry from the audience. Like some people thought it was way too high. Some people thought it was way too low. The people who thought it was way too low have won. Because Garrett Crochet has moved up to, I think he's the number 5 pitcher. If you don't count Shohei, Garrett Crochet is the number 5 SP in ADP right now. I can't do it. I love Garrett Crochet. I think there's a chance he's the best pitcher in baseball, right? Like last year, he had the highest K- walk ratio in the league. He had, I think, the lowest xFIP in the league. He was among the top 4 in basically every pitching estimator you could think of. But again, this is a guy who threw, I think, 145 innings last year. Before that, going back to 2020 when he was drafted, I think it was like 85 innings total. He had been a reliever. He didn't pitch full time in his final year at college because it was the COVID year, so nobody did. He came back from Tommy John surgery. He pitched awesome in the first half of last season. He was arguably the best pitcher in baseball. The second half was a lot rockier. I think it's reasonable to write that off as just the White Sox of it all, right? The the way they were completely uncompetitive as a team, and the way they treated him uncompetitively, right? Like, to play at the highest level and know no matter what I do, they're going to pull me after 4 innings and I have no chance of a win and my team's going to stink around me. Like, that stuff matters. I think that probably explains a lot of why Luis Robert was so bad last year and why I'm hoping he gets traded. It's hard to get yourself up and play at the highest level in that way. It's still just an open question for me about Garrett Crochet and how likely it is that can he keep doing this in July, August, September? I think the talent is absolutely there. I just don't know if the body's going to hold up. And I'm pretty surprised that his ADP has gotten all the way here. I know the move from Chicago to Boston, switching the Sox, that helps. He's going to get more wins, everything about it. But I can't justify that price for a guy who hasn't shown me the ability to hold up to 100. Like, literally has never thrown 150 innings in a season, let alone 180. So I am surprised that Garrett Crochet is going this far ahead of Chris Sale, who has his own concerns, obviously, but on an inning for inning basis was just as good, if not better, than Garrett Crochet last year. Overcame all his injury concerns last year and is still being treated a little bit skeptically. His ADP is only about a half round later than Garrett Crochet, but I don't think I could take Crochet if Chris Sale was on the board, for instance.
Yeah, I'll say with Crochet, again, I'm completely willing to ignore the second half of the season with the trade rumors for a solid month, and then being pulled after 2, and so I think he gets a pass for that. But again, where's the resume? It's last year. It's a half of a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was all over Crochet at the beginning. I kept telling every week, I felt like I was telling everyone, pick him up. And then finally picking him up. Don't trade him. Don't trade him.
He had those 3 awesome starts at the beginning. Then he had like 3 kind of mediocre starts and a bunch of people dropped him or like, we knew it was a fluke. And I was like, no, look, like you show the upside he showed early on. I'm not getting rid of that. Like, it's got to be a complete disaster for me to be out on him. And it worked out.
Yeah, the tricky thing was the second half, but like you said, I'm looking now, just narrowing down the ADP just the past week. You're right; he's right behind, one spot behind Zach Wheeler, who has been doing it for years. I mean, what else do we need to see with Zach Wheeler? And he's been consistent. There's no, I can't say there's no. He's a pitcher. There's injury risk, but you know what I mean. We haven't seen it. And even Tariq Skubal, are we ignoring the fact that just before last year he had an IL stint for a while? I mean, there's no risk-free pitcher at all. So I generally agree with all of that. You don't need to get the number 1, number 2 pitcher out there. You need a staff, and you need a staff that'll hold up. And so, just generally.
And my approach to starting pitcher is kind of, to borrow some football terminology, I kind of go like hero SP, like the idea of like the hero RB versus 0 RB, where actually did make a championship and I'm favored to win a championship where Javonte Williams has been my best running back. So 0 RB can still work.
That's amazing.
But it's caused me a lot of stress throughout the course of the year. And that's kind of the same way pitcher can work, where like you can just completely fade starting pitcher until like the 10th round and build a decent pitching staff. I prefer to kind of anchor my rotation with at least one guy I feel reasonably confident I'm going to get 180 good innings out of. I think Zach Wheeler fits that mold. I think Logan Gilbert fits that mold. I think Corbin Burns, who's probably going to be pretty controversial this offseason, and obviously we don't know where he's going to be pitching, so that's a concern. But I think Corbin Burns is a pretty good case of that, where, okay, the 90th percentile outcome for Paul Skeens is much higher than the 90th percentile for Corbin Burns. Like, if everything comes together, I still think the 50th percentile for Corbin Burns makes for an easier approach to building the rest of my pitching staff. I like to have ideally 2 guys in my first like 7 or 8 picks who just give me a solid base, because I'm not going to take any pitchers for a while. I'm pretty comfortable if I can get my 2 guys in the first 6 or 7 picks who I feel have good strikeout upside, give me a solid volume base. And then I take my chances in the, 150 plus range on, Spencer Arrighetti or whoever who I think has upside, but things could go wrong. If things go wrong, at least I have that base to fall back on. And that's why it's harder for me to take Skeens or especially Crochet, just because it's so easy to see how things can go wrong. And if you take Skeens, can you really take a Blake Snell or a Jacob deGrom? I don't think so. I think it also, that's another one where it cuts you off from, like, let's say I'm in one of those drafts where Blake Snell falls or Jacob deGrom, where I'm not comfortable drafting them at their current price. But if they fall a little bit, it's like, oh yeah, I can see how things can go right. It's a lot easier for me to stomach that if I've got Zach Wheeler and I know I'm as confident as I can be about a pitcher that they're going to give me 200 good innings or 190 good innings. That makes it a little easier to handle a Jacob deGrom, where if you take Garrett Crochet in the third, you probably need to avoid some of those riskier pitchers as your SB2, SP3, just because you start to need a little bit of certainty baked into your staff at some point.
Absolutely. And look, if I'm taking a Wheeler and a Crochet and or a Jacob deGrom, I'm also probably going too heavy on pitching too early anyway.
Sure,
so I'm risking other things. Well, speaking of pitching, I thought it was interesting in your article, again, targets and fades at early ADP, just taking a look at, what the early drafters are doing. No pitchers were mentioned, and I know it's harder to gauge those pitchers. Is there anybody, it doesn't have to just be a pitcher, but is there anybody who you like that is a good value, screaming value, you feel like is going too late, pitcher or not, that you didn't mention in the article? And I don't want to name all the players you said because I want people to read it, but
I did actually write a pitching specific version of this article, like I think it was a week after that one. So it went out earlier last week. So I do have some out there. It's easier for me to find pitching prices I don't like this year than pitchers I do like. I think Skeens, deGrom, Crochet are all just kind of going a little too high. But among pitchers that I like at value, one thing you see with these NFC drafts there are a lot of things about the early ADP tendencies that we see from this group that I think makes sense, right? Like when you're talking about the risk of taking injury risks or, guys whose roles are uncertain, I understand why those guys tend to fall. One thing I don't get is why players who are unsigned but are definitely going to sign somewhere tend to fall. And I think like Max Fried is a good example of this, where he, I assume he'll start to push up, but he's been outside of the top 100. And I think there are risks involved with Max Fried. He doesn't have the strikeout upside that we're often looking for. But one, if the Yankees were willing to give him $200 million, I don't know Max Fried's medicals better than the Yankees do. So like if they're willing to give him that much money, I'm going to say that maybe my concerns about his injury risk might be a little overblown. This is a team, after all, that backed off of trading for Jack Flaherty this season because of concerns about his medicals. So they are willing to back away from a player if they're concerned about it. Fried is a rock solid, one of the best. Like, it's hard to be an ERA specialist because if you're good at ERA, you're good at everything as a starting pitcher. He is one of the guys who really does outperform his peripherals pretty consistently. He's almost always a sub-3 ERA guy. And his price is about 40 picks lower than it was this time last year. I just don't think that makes sense for Max Fried. There was the forearm neuritis, the nerve issue in his forearm. That's always concerning. Anytime you hear the forearm thing, the Braves maintained throughout that there was no structural issue. It was just a nerve inflammation. He didn't miss very much time. He came back, was a little shaky, but then got back on the track, had a 2.39 ERA after the 5 starts where he gave up 18 runs in 25 and 2/3 innings. I still think he's going to be a standout in ERA. I think the volume there's some concerns, but usually gets to 150 innings at least. As a 100th pick, I think Max Fried makes a ton of sense. Kirby Yates. I guess there is some concern that Kirby Yates will sign somewhere where he's a setup man. I don't think it's particularly likely. And he's going after Lucas Erceg and Ryan Walker. I like those guys, but Ryan Walker has a very short track record. Lucas Erceg was a position player not that long ago. I think both of them are really good, but I'm fairly confident Kirby Yates is a much better pitcher than those guys. I'm fairly confident he's going to get signed somewhere where he's going to be the closer. So I get some kind of discount on Kirby Yates, but I think he's going, 50 to 70 picks after similarly talented relievers. So I love the value there. I mentioned Spencer Arrighetti. It's so interesting which guys do and don't get the, hey, did you see what they did in the second half bump? Because Arrighetti, the overall numbers, 4.53 ERA, 141 whip, that's really bad. He had, over his final 10 appearances, a 2.72 ERA, 67 strikeouts in 53 innings. His fastball's a little iffy, and that, I think, is the biggest concern with Spencer Arrighetti from a talent perspective, but curveball, sweeper, and changeup all have whiff rates over 37%. He showed in the second half when he went on that run that he started to figure some things out. I think as a whole, we have faith in the Astros figuring these things out. We saw it with Yusei Kikuchi. We saw it with Hunter Brown. And it's just interesting that Spencer Arrighetti's still going, I think, outside of the top 220 in ADP. And I think at that point, I don't care about the downside. Like with my 220th pick, especially in a managed league, not a best ball league, if he has a couple of bad starts early on, okay, it's not going to work out. You can move on, bench him, drop him, whatever. But at that point, you should only be considering upside. And I think Spencer Arrighetti clearly has a ton of upside. So I am genuinely surprised that he has been as reasonably priced as he has been. I do think if you get into like the psychology of the fantasy player, there was 1 week last year where like he was the clear top waiver pick. He had 2 really good starts. I'm trying to remember. And then he was going against, I think it was the White Sox, and he just completely flopped. And I feel like people might just have that in their head, holding it against him. It was like the one bad start that Spencer Arrighetti, he had these 2 straight starts against the Rays and the Red Sox where he struck out 12 and 13. He was dominant. And then he was set up for a 2-start week. White Sox were the first start, and he gave up 4 earned runs in 5 2/3 innings against the White Sox. And I feel like that soured a lot of people on Spencer Arrighetti. So whatever the justification is for why people aren't more excited about him, I will take the relative discount on what I think Arrighetti should be.
Yeah, and the funny thing, looking at that, after that White Sox start, then he dominated the Orioles and the Phillies. So
the only 2 bad starts he had in the second half, I think, were against the Reds and the White Sox, which 2 teams you probably started him against, so it didn't work out well, but I'm not going to hold that against him. I think the skill set is fairly obvious and worth getting excited about.
Yeah, I think he just got off to such a bad start where in the very first start of the season, he got lit up, and then he came out, his first couple of starts were just not good. Came out with like an 11 ERA after the first month of the season. So it was like, I can't consider. And, this is where I always preach, to our viewers, people, you can't just look at the season long stats. You can't just look at the ratios. Like, look at the last 2 weeks, look at what he's done, recently against certain competition. And yeah, he ended on a tear. So yeah, Arrighetti's definitely a guy I like late. Agree with that. As far as starting pitchers, I think are good values. I still feel like despite what he did last year, Shota Imanaga is getting a little disrespected. I know he didn't end as strong as he started, but still, I think he's just one of those guys you can set as like the middle of your rotation as a staple and help your ratios. He's somebody I'll be drafting quite a bit. And then I'm not really sure why. I mean, Grayson Rodriguez is a guy I'm always going to be a super fan of. He was so good, and then he got hurt, and kind of disrupted his season. But I still think he's got top tier talent there.
And in his case, I think part of it is there is a tendency, and I'm guilty of it, I think we're all guilty of it, of looking at what players are, or maybe what we think they should be, rather than what they are. And I think Grayson Rodriguez probably suffers a little bit from that because he was the most hyped pitching prospect in the world for like 2 full years. Yeah. And then he's gone to the majors and he's been good, but it always feels like he should be a little better, right? Like you look at the individual pitches and it's like, man, he gets whiffs on everything. Like it's above average whiff rates, I think, on all 5 of his pitches. And then the overall production is just good. It's not elite. And it feels like maybe we're holding that against him. And then I think the fact that he's missed pretty significant time 2 out of the past 3 seasons with injuries is also being held against him. And the fact that it's a recurring, I believe it was a lat injury both times. I don't know quite how to feel about that because on the one hand, anytime you have the same injury twice, that's a huge red flag, right? Because it's like there's something that's causing that rather than like if he strained his hamstring and an oblique. It's like, well, those are, the oblique bone and the hamstring bone aren't connected, right? Like I think those are different mechanisms. But with Rodriguez, it's also like, well, it hasn't been an elbow. It hasn't been a shoulder. Like structurally, everything should be okay as it can be for a young pitcher who throws, 97 miles an hour. So I'm not sure quite how to feel about him, but I agree. Like a 104 ADP for Grayson Rodriguez, at worst, it feels pretty reasonable. It's easier for me to find the pitchers that I'm just not going to draft. And he's not on that list. Like there are a handful of pitchers who I'm just almost certainly not going to have on any of my teams this year. Grayson Rodriguez will not be on that list. Can I make one more name who's just going way too late?
Of course.
Anytime you have a player whose ADP drops like 300 spots in a year and they are currently healthy, you should draft that pitcher. And that's the case with Jesus Luzardo, who I was completely out on this time last year. He was, I think, like top 80 in ADP, maybe top 70. And like there are real things to be concerned about with Jesus Luzardo. And, he has a long injury history. It got longer last year. He missed time with a forearm injury, missed time with the back injury. Less concerned about the back, which actually cost him most of the time that he missed. The forearm, I think he only missed like 3 or 4 weeks before coming back with the forearm. Obviously, 2024 was just a disaster. He didn't pitch well. He was hurt. It makes perfect sense why Jesus Luzardo's value went down. And just looking at the total package without considering injury and how he pitched in 2024, he has a very fringy fastball. This was something that, Saris pointed out before last season where like if Jesus Luzardo is over 96 with his fastball, everything comes together really well. The fastball plays up, the curveball and changeup are obviously very, very good pitches no matter what. When the fastball gets below 96, like it was last year, it tends to get hit pretty hard. And he doesn't have the command to overcome that. And it's a fairly slim margin for error. When you're talking about the 80th pick, that stuff matters. Jesus Luzardo's ADP this year in the month of December is 426. I think it's okay. It's gone up a little bit. It's improved a little bit since the trade to, I am completely blanking on where he got traded to. Philadelphia. Which is not the best landing spot in terms of the home park. But like, look, man, if he's going to be a 10.7 K per 9 guy, you don't really worry about the home park. Like that stuff matters on the margins. And if he's not going to be a 10.7 K per 9 guy, it probably just doesn't matter and you drop him. Right? Like this is one that, again, I feel like we'll have a pretty good sense of whether Luzardo is going to be useful if in spring training he's averaging 96, 97 with his fastball. If he comes out and he's averaging 94, 95, I think we can move on from Jesus Luzardo. But if he's going to go outside of the top 400, which means that in a 12-team roto league, he might go undrafted. Yes, I will throw a bench spot at Jesus Luzardo. That's a bench spot in a 15-team league. So I think I'm not saying Jesus Luzardo should be a top 200 pick even, but I'll take him around 300 if I want to take an upside flyer at starting pitcher. That's an easy one.
Yeah, I'd be super nervous to draft Luzardo, but like you said, if he's basically a last round pick, he's
There's
got
no
the
risk.
upside. Hmm?
Yeah.
Which logically speaking, he's probably going to go off because this is what happens, as you know, long-suffering Marlins fan like me. When the Marlins get rid of a player, which is basically every player that becomes good, then they become great for other teams. So that would be totally unsurprising. So I have a serious question, and
Yes.
you know this is serious as a Marlins fan. And there's not many people I can speak to and say that in seriousness, a fan of the Marlins. There's not many of us left. Legitimately want to know, could the Marlins be this year's Chicago White Sox? Because they have made it a mission to gut that team since last year. And Luzardo is just the latest piece. I mean, sure, we have a lot of prospects, great prospects. Sure. But honestly, how many wins is this team even going to get?
I would take the over on what was it, 42 for the White Sox last year. Whatever they end up winning, I'll take the over on that. That's a pretty easy call. Things have to go you have to have the White Sox were not as bad as the White Sox were last year. Things have to go really bad for that to happen. And I think you look at the Marlins and their farm system is better for how many guys they've traded over the last couple of years. You would prefer that their farm system was good, but it's not yet. I think it's better, and there's a lot of interesting names. But the one thing I will say is the Marlins are absolutely a team that, as bad as they will look on opening day, it will almost certainly look better later in the season. And that's not just because guys will emerge unexpectedly, which happens for every team, hopefully, but also because I can see Sandy Alcantara struggling in April. It'll be his first time pitching since the end of the 2023 season, but I'm pretty confident that Sandy Alcantara is going to be very good at some point this season. Yuri Perez will probably be back May, June, July. So you've got those two guys. You've got, again, a pretty good minor league system, but what I like about what Peter Bendix has done with the trades they've made is they have prioritized guys who have produced in the high minors. A lot of the trades, especially for the hitters, Agustin Ramirez, Davison De Los Santos, guys like that, who I don't know if they'll be stars, right? Like Agustin Ramirez, it's unclear he's going to stick at catcher. There are some hit tool concerns. He wasn't quite as good at AAA as he was at AA. I get all those concerns. Davison De Los Santos, he's put up massive numbers, but nobody seems to really believe it. But they should be better as the season goes on, as they, I don't think Ramirez, Davison De Los Santos, those guys are going to come up to start the season, but I think they'll be up at some point fairly early on. So I think there will be some help. Robbie Snelling, Adam Major, guys that may not make the opening day roster, but will have the ability to contribute in May, June, July, and moving forward. So I think the Marlins are going to be right there with the White Sox for the worst team in baseball. I don't think there's any question about it. I am not an optimist in a lot of ways. I've been a Marlins fan for too long to be optimistic. But I think they've got a vision that makes sense. I think Peter Bendix has done a pretty good job acquiring some interesting pieces. And, there's still a lot of pitching talent. There's enough pitching talent there that things can go wrong, as they did in 2024. You can see ways in which, Max Meyer takes a step forward in his second season back from Tommy John surgery. And, I'm not going to say Edward Cabrera figures it out because that feels like a hopeless cause, but there's a chance. Or, Robbie Snelling, the gains he made after the trade, he was one of the most hyped pitching prospects in the whole league a year ago and then started to show some signs once he got traded to the Marlins system. So I think the pitching staff could be decent enough that they're unlikely to be as bad as the White Sox were last year, at least. I think they're better than the I think they're better than the White Sox right now.
That's very optimistic of you. Look,
yeah,
they won 62 games last year. They weren't worse than the National League. Apparently, the Rockies won 61. The White Sox were at 41, so there's a gap there. Look, the pitching will be adequate, like you said. We got some semi-experienced players. The offense,
it's gonna be bad.
It's gonna be bad.
I'm 36 years old. The Marlins have been around almost as long as I have. They've been really bad almost as long as they've been around. So the fact that I'm still a Marlins fan at this point, there's a little bit of masochism there. There's a little bit of like, do I deserve better? I'm not sure I do. I'll stay with the Marlins, I guess. It's not healthy, but it's who I am, you know?
It's like we said at the top. I mean, you just no matter when this is one thing I talk about too with all my friends, people I grew up with. No matter where you live or where you go, you're from South Florida, you're a Miami boy, whatever it is. You just feel like that's who you are. You're always I'm always gonna root for my Miami teams, no matter what, good or bad, which is mostly bad,
even if they don't deserve it. And for the most part, South Florida teams in our lifetimes have not really deserved a lot of love.
No,
a couple of notable exceptions.
No, maybe. This won't be a great year, but good or bad, we're there, and it'll be interesting to see. But hey, a lot of possible waiver wire pickups for fantasy because they won't be drafted.
For sure.
All right. Well, Chris, it's been great. Thank you so much for joining us, and of course, anybody else not seeing the work, it's CBS. I think you probably heard of them, CBS Sports. And you're doing is it a weekly newsletter?
Right now, it's twice a week. I'm off for the holidays, but starting in January, it'll probably be, we'll see, about 3 times a week. But cbssports.com/newsletters. It's the Fantasy Baseball Today newsletter. And by the time March 1st rolls around, we'll probably be going daily. So there will be a ton. It's free. You just have to give your email address. It'll be in your inbox 5 times a week from March through October. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of fun. I think it's a good product. And the Fantasy Baseball Today podcast is also, I think we'll be going 3 days a week starting in the beginning of January. So that's exciting too.
Very nice. Very nice. A lot of good work there. So check it out. Thank you again. And thank you everyone watching. Keep it locked here. I won't be going quite that often just yet. We gotta wait for football season to wrap up first. It's almost there, and then we'll dive into baseball. There you go, guys. Hit the subscribe button, like if you haven't already, and turn on notifications. Appreciate you, and we'll see you on the next one.